It's my big pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer, Professor for Southeast European History and Politics, Director of Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz, member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts, and just great person, Professor Florіан Бібер. Today we will talk about the enlargement and democracy as external policies of the European Union. And after the lecture, we will traditionally have some time for the questions and comments. So, dear Professor Bieber, the floor is yours. We can start.
Alina, thank you so much for inviting me to this lecture. It's my real pleasure to be talking to you today. I also have a presentation to go with it. I hope you can see it well.
Yes.
Good. And so feel free to also ask any questions, or if anything is unclear, I will have time afterwards, but also if you have any questions while I'm giving my thoughts, please feel free to raise a question. I think you just have to put up your hand or something so I can see it, your virtual hand, because otherwise I will not notice it. So I think it's a very excited to talk to you because I've been over the last 6 months in different formats talking with colleagues from Ukraine about EU enlargement, as well as the difficulties in the Western Balkans and what Ukraine can learn when on its journey to the European Union from some of the challenges the countries of the Western Balkans experienced. And Alina, as you said, you asked me and we discussed that I would talk about enlargement and the question of democracy and democratization as two processes and how they link together. And as you can see here, the cartoon I have found, which suggests the difficulty many of the countries in the Western Balkans have been facing in joining the European Union. In fact, it's a long process, and I know that Ukraine has made very fast progress in the first steps towards joining the European Union and receiving candidate status in the midst of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So I think it is an important and very, very encouraging sign. But of course, it's the beginning of a process, not the end of a process. And so this is something I'm also happy to talk to you about in the discussion. Now, the idea of enlargement, of course, has been around nearly since the beginning of the European Union. And in the early phases, nobody really cared about democracy, not because the EU was not democratic, but because it was not a worry so much or a concern. The EU was always, or the European Economic Community was always about democracy. But in the early phases of the 1960s, 70s, and that period, it was anyhow only democracies which were seen to be, it was much more seen as countries were either democratic or not democratic. And if they were not democratic, of course, they could not join. On one side, of course, this included the countries behind the Iron Curtain, such as East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on. This was not imaginable, even not from the democracy point of view, but from the point of view of being Soviet dominated. But there were also other countries in Europe which were not democratic, but not Soviet dominated. Greece was a military dictatorship in the late 60s and early 70s. Spain and Portugal were dictatorships until the mid 70s. So they were clearly not eligible to join the European Union. So the only countries which tried to join were actually the only countries in Northern Europe which joined in the 70s, which was Great Britain, Ireland, and Denmark. Norway was also thinking of joining at the time. Democracy was not a question. So the first, in a certain way, post-authoritarian enlargement of the European Union occurred when some of the Southern European countries shook off their military dictatorships in the 1970s. So there we have Greece, which joined first in 1981, after the military junta fell 6-7 years before that in 1974. And then Spain and Portugal in 1986. So this was in a certain way the first enlargement where democratization was important. But all three countries were seen as sufficiently clearly democratic that it was not a central, let's say, requirement, but it was understood that they were democratic enough. The next big wave of enlargement, well, I should mention, and maybe I'll put that I have the list of countries. The first country which joined the European Union after the end of the Cold War was East Germany, the first post-communist country. But of course, it joined because it stopped existing as a country. It joined by joining Germany, so it didn't have to fulfill any of the criteria. It's the only, I guess you could call it, former country which ever joined the European Union without doing anything besides joining Germany. But of course, that is a very exceptional way of joining the European Union, and not one which is open to other countries who don't want to join and stop existing as a state. So the next big wave was the three neutrals, Finland, Sweden, and Austria. Again, not so much questions of democracy. All three were long established democratic countries. So there was no question that they were joining the European Union and that they were both more prosperous than the average of the EU and as democratic as the rest of the European Union. So this was really not a concern. So the real question of how to become a democratic member of the European Union really asked itself when the countries which were formerly communist sought to join. And this is the Copenhagen criteria, which were established to this year, in fact, 30 years ago. So they've been around since 1993, and they, for the first time, outline the key criteria to join the European Union. Now, it's important to realize that what they say is nothing, or for the most part, is nothing new. It was just for the first time that it was clearly defined. So it required democracy, rule of law, human rights, including minority rights, a functioning market economy to, as they call, withstand the pressures of the European Union, the market pressures, and to take on the obligations of membership, which means, for example, the goal to join the euro or to support the foreign policy of the European Union. So this really, for the first time, lays out and puts also the democracy at the center of EU enlargement. Now, this was really relevant for the Eastern enlargement, the 10 countries which joined nearly just about a decade later in 2004. And so you can see here that all of a sudden democracy became important. And that this was not just a formality was clear when, for example, Slovakia had a government led by Vladimir Mečiar, who was openly undermining democratic institutions. And it became clear that Slovakia would not be able to join the European Union if it would not have a more democratic government. And citizens in Slovakia organized in a mass mobilization in 1998 and in the elections of that year overthrew the government of Vladimir Mečiar. And this is Vladimir Mečiar. And this shows in a certain way the power of enlargement and its linkage to democracy at that particular moment. It made it clear that to join the European Union required a democracy, and not just a formal constitutional democracy, but a functional democracy, and that was strong enough as a motivator for citizens to overthrow, through elections, an undemocratic government. And in a certain way, of course, we can say this foreshadows is a precedent for later such democratic movements. We could list in it the challenge to the government of Slobodan Milošević in 2000 in Serbia, or also the two mass protests in Ukraine, including the protests on Maidan as well, which all were about democracy and about European integration. So, as you can see here, there is a linkage between enlargement and democracy. Now, of course, it's not only democracy to join the European Union. There are other criteria. One, which is maybe banal, is that the country has to be European. In fact, Morocco once applied to join the European Union, and it was rejected because the EU said it's not in Europe. Now, that is very clear for the case of Morocco, but it came to a different conclusion when it came to Turkey, for example. Turkey is, as you all know, both in Europe and in Asia. And in fact, the biggest part of Turkey is in Asia. Yet, EU has begun accession talks. They have not gone very far, but clearly the EU found Turkey to be enough in Europe to be formally qualified to join the European Union. And so certainly this question seems to be also positively answered when it comes to Georgia, which is another country which certainly geographically is on the borderlines between Europe and Asia. It has not answered this question, for example, when it comes to Azerbaijan, where one can ask a similar question. But it seems to be from the practice of the European Union that if a country is at least partly in Europe, then it can become a member state. But the EU is certainly not the Eurovision Song Contest when it comes to membership. So I don't think Israel or Australia will be able to join the European Union. But again, this is no question for Ukraine because clearly it is a country entirely in Europe, and thus this is not a challenge. But the other elements are, as you can see here from the Copenhagen criteria, it's democracy, it's the rule of law, which is more than just narrow democracy, as well as protection of human and minority rights. And then a functioning market economy and a political and legal framework to adopt and implement the acquis communautaire, which means all the rules and regulations of the European Union. Now, to give you an example of how this is different from the others, I'll give you the example of Bosnia-Herzegovina. As you know, Bosnia is a country which also experienced a war in the 1990s and has a very weak central government, a very weak parliament, which is very often blocked. And while it is a democracy, a flawed democracy, but it is a democracy, it has a very hard time to implement the acquis communautaire, the rules and regulations of the European Union, because its parliament is very slow in taking decisions. So if you want to join the European Union, you have to adopt most of the laws and rules which the EU has adopted over the decades. And people nowadays often say it's something like 80, 90, or probably at some already now 100,000 pages of laws and regulations, because the EU has been making them for over half a century. And to join them, you have to adopt all of these rules. And somebody, maybe not calculating precisely, but said in Bosnia, if the Bosnian parliament is as fast as it is now, it will take another 50 years to adopt all the laws and regulations because it is such a slow process in the parliament. Now, this is exaggerating maybe, but it shows also that a country which wants to join has to adopt a lot of laws and regulations to join the European Union, because the EU is most importantly a space of shared laws, of shared rules. So if you're producing certain products, they have to be produced according to similar standards, so that if you make milk in one country, you can export it to another, and people trust that it's made by the same, or at least agreed similar standards of hygiene and food protection. And so this is these rules, which are much broader and much more complicated than, quote unquote, just being a democracy. The other criteria, which was also defined in Copenhagen and which has become important, are the so-called absorption capacity of the European Union. What this means is the ability of the European Union. Now, this has become very important as an element, because what it means is the EU also has to be able to have the rules and the ability to take care of new member states. Because you have to understand that joining the European Union is not just joining a club, but it also means new members in the European Parliament. It means a new commissioner in the Commission. It means all the institutional inclusion of a new country. And that, of course, is something which requires the EU to be ready as well. And this is something which is easier said than done. The European Parliament is already a very big parliament with over 700 members. The Commission is very big with lots of commissioners, and one wonders whether, in fact, there is a commissioner needed for every member state. So the EU's institutions have to adopt. So ironically, in many ways, it is not more complicated for a country like Ukraine to join from this point of view than a country like Montenegro to join, which is more than I think around 20 times smaller than Ukraine in terms of population. Because in many institutional changes, there isn't much difference between a small and a big country. In other areas, of course, there is very much a significant difference between a large country and a small country. The other element which is important to realize is that there is the legal joining and there is a political process of joining. So indeed, to join formally, these criteria have to be fulfilled. But political criteria are just as important. And they also mean, for example, that individual member states can block the accession process. This is something which has been felt across the Western Balkans, where we've had, for example, North Macedonia blocked towards the European Union, first by Greece, then by France, and now by Bulgaria. So any of the 27 member states can block a new country at any point in time. And this is legally possible at multiple steps along the way. And the country doesn't have to give good reasons to do so. It can just say, we don't like the other country. Well, usually they come up with a better reason. But when you look at the reasons, for example, which Bulgaria has had in blocking North Macedonia, those are very unconvincing reasons. These are reasons such as saying Macedonian is the same language as Bulgarian, and so the Macedonians should recognize they don't have a separate language or history, which is hardly a good reason to block a country. So it shows you that besides the formal legal criteria, which are based on clear standards, there are other criteria which can be much more arbitrary, much more random. Now, this shows you some of the challenges. Now, the logic of the enlargement process has been of two pillars, as I will briefly mention to you, of conditionality and Europeanization. So conditionality is the idea that the EU sets conditions and they are fulfilled by the domestic actors, and that by doing so, you transform the institutions and laws through these requirements, and that they become more democratic, more rule of law based. This is a logic, of course, which is not only used by the European Union, but many other institutions are requiring conditions to join. NATO has conditions to join, and other international organizations require something similar, just like the IMF or the World Bank have conditions to receive funding from them. Now, what we often find is that this is a very mechanical understanding of change. And when it comes to democracy and democratization, it's not just about formal institutions. I mean, nearly every country on the European continent has democratic institutions, formally speaking. But we all know that that does not translate into democracy. So legally, the constitution of Turkey is a democratic constitution, but the government is not democratic. Or more extreme, the constitution of Russia is a democratic constitution, but it's a dictatorship. So you cannot have just the laws, but they have to work as democratic laws. And this is the real challenge. So conditionality only goes part of the way because it's about the formal changes of the laws. A whole literature talks about Europeanization, and there is a whole many different definitions of Europeanization. But one of the key kind of points is that it's not just about laws, but it's about understanding the practice of those laws. So the idea that people often also talks about norm socialization, that by joining the process of the European Union by accession, one is socialized, that the elites and the societies are socialized to act in a certain way, which is promoting democracy. So that democratization is not just a requirement, but by the interaction between the European Union and a country to join, there is a practice, a reality of democratization. This at least has been the theory, that because the EU is a pluralist actor, it requires countries to be democratic, that it in a certain way promotes a democratic communication and interaction. Now, this is the assumption, and I will mention some of these aspects, but also be quite critical, or at least raising some questions. So the idea is that Europeanization changes the institutions because it's about the legal change. You know, if you look at the EU integration process, it requires certain institutions, for example, independent courts, independent judiciary more broadly, independent institutions such as ombudsperson institutions, and so on. It requires domestic politics to be adjusted. So talking about the kind of economic, social, and security arrangements to for elites to be openly supporting EU integration. And as a result, that the domestic politics becomes more pro-European and adopts the ideas of European integration. And that is taken up not just by elites, but by broader social actors, by political parties, by trade unions, by civil society, and that all of them are adopting in a certain way the ideas of, let's say, democratic understanding in the European Union. So there is a socialization element. This is the idea of Europeanization. Now, this is always inherently an asymmetric relationship. EU integration is asymmetric because a country joins the European Union. The European Union doesn't join the country. The European Union sets the rule. So sometimes people call it accession negotiations. And it's actually a bit of a misleading word because negotiation suggests some level of equality, that two partners are negotiating and saying, you do this, I do that. But the accession process, joining the European Union, is only negotiating how a country fulfills the criteria to join the European Union. It doesn't change the European Union, but it changes the country's way of laws, rules, decision-making. And the negotiation is just about when to do what to join the European Union. So there is an inequality built into that because it's a country joining the Union. Now, of course, a lot of scholarship, a lot of academics have been saying it's more complicated in reality. And it's true because the change goes both ways to some degree, not in the legal sense, not in the formal sense, but informally. These changes often go in different directions. It also means that one of the big challenges, which I'll come, which the many challenges which come with enlargement, is that the EU itself, for example, has to rely on the rules of other organizations when it comes to questions of democracy and human rights. The EU has not a single set of rules of what it means to be a democracy. You have all kinds of democracies in the European Union, right? So you have monarchies which have democratic systems, like Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg are all monarchies, but they're democracies. You have federal systems like Austria or Germany. You have highly centralized systems like France, or you have states where religion has a very strong constitutional role, like Greece, and you have very secular states like the Czech Republic. You have thus a very broad range of types of democracy in the European Union. So it's very hard to set a clear definition. And the EU itself borrows from other organizations, such as the Council of Europe, in defining what makes a democracy, how to, in a certain way, see whether a country is democratic enough. So these are not easy processes to insist on. And as you can understand, it's one thing to say the constitution is democratic or undemocratic, but it's much more tricky to say, is the political system actually behaving in a democratic way? Because in fact, sometimes formally it looks democratic, but in practice it is not. And one, and I want to maybe, before I continue, mention this, of course, that the EU also has very little ways to protect once a country is a member from becoming less democratic. And we have several examples which countries which have, once they have become members, have become a lot less democratic. Both Hungary as well as Poland are two countries which probably with the current governments could not join the European Union because they would be considered to be not democratic enough. But once you are inside the European Union, the EU has very few ways of, quote unquote, punishing a country from not being democratic. Because the assumption always was that once you're in, you are democratic and that this is irreversible. And this has been a painful discovery over the last decade or more that democracy is reversible, that you can be democratic and become less democratic to the degree that we can question whether a country is actually a functioning democracy. And I think most scholars would agree that certainly Hungary today is no longer a democratic country. It has elections, it has democratic institutions, but it's not a functional democracy because of the way in which the ruling party is controlling the institutions, the media, and the political and social landscape of the country. Now, the enlargement itself, of course, is not just about democracy. Why do countries want to join? There are multiple reasons. Some of them are value-based. The ideas of a return to Europe, the idea of European unity, or the injustices of Yalta or other past divisions of Europe. There might be security issues, either to be protected in a certain way, or other indirect security understandings. Economic benefits, the markets, the assistance, the benefits members receive within the European Union, such as financial assistance, economic development assistance. And so basically, there are multiple reasons why both countries want to join, but also why countries want to accept new member states. But and there are many of these challenges about enlargement which have made this process often very difficult. These are in a certain way more abstract reasons, but there are, of course, more specific ones. So from within the European Union, it's the institutional readiness to join, for new countries to join. I've mentioned this already. This has been called the so-called absorption capacity. This is, Joe, I would say, the least part. The biggest two challenges are really public opinion. Do citizens want enlargement? And citizens in the European Union often are quite skeptical about enlargement. The reason, and we can talk about that, are multiple. One is that citizens might worry that enlargement might reduce their own benefits in the European Union. Less money to be around, more cost. And you will certainly find this about asking citizens when it comes to enlargement towards whether it is Ukraine or the Western Balkans, that citizens might worry that they will be confronted with a very high cost of enlargement, or they might see the countries as being too different, too alien, too unfamiliar to be part of the European Union. And certainly we find this when it comes to Turkey, that many EU citizens are very against the membership of Turkey because it's seen as quite different. And there are some, you could say, even Islamophobic arguments there. The other reasons why countries might be against enlargement has to do with migration, that they worry that citizens might migrate to them, because one of the elements of EU membership is, at least in the long term, full mobility of citizens. And for example, in Britain, it had allowed citizens from the new member states, such as Poland and the others, that they could automatically and very quickly move freely to Britain, and tens of thousands of especially Poles moved to Britain after 2004, and in fact contributed a lot to the economic benefits of Britain. But many in Britain saw this as a threat to their identity and were quite hostile towards enlargement as a result, and that contributed to the strong support for Brexit in 2016. Other reasons are economic, that citizens and countries worry about the costs of enlargement. And this is something we see in the arguments in countries which are both beneficiaries of enlargement at the moment, that they might have to share those rewards with future member states. Worries, challenges in the countries are, economic readiness. Is the country willing or able to withstand the competition in the European Union? The challenge of once a country is in, there are no more conditions. So will there be democratic backsliding? Sorry, I'm just, or what about the political stability within the country? So I will now maybe talk a bit about the process of joining the European Union, the multiple steps and how long it takes, to give you a sense of the challenges in the process. So here I've just got a table of some countries of the Western Balkans and Bulgaria for comparison, to show you the many steps along the way. And what you can see here are the different formal steps in joining the European Union. So usually these are, in the case of the Western Balkans, they were the so-called stabilization and association agreements, which were called Europe agreements before that, in the case of Central Europe, and which are similar to the association agreement with Ukraine has signed with the European Union, and which has come to effect between the EU and Ukraine already. Then we have the membership application. You can see that in Bulgaria happened in 1995. In the Western Balkans, it mostly happened in the 2000s. And this is, of course, the application which came from Ukraine last year. And then between that and getting candidate status, you can see here, in most countries, there have been several years which have passed. So unlike in the case of Ukraine, where this happened in a few months, in Bulgaria, it took 4 years, in Croatia, 1 year, in Montenegro, 2, and so on. So somewhere between, the longest of all of them was in the case of Bosnia, where it took 6 years. So again, candidate status is where Ukraine is now, and you can see here this in the countries I've given as examples is between 1999 and 2022, Bosnia being the country which got candidate status 6 months after Ukraine. And then the next step is, of course, membership negotiations, which is the next step. And in many years can pass between the two. And so, for example, if you take an extreme case such as North Macedonia, it got candidate status in 2005, and it still has not really begun membership negotiations. It got a signal for the start last year, but even that was not full negotiations. But even if we take last year, we can say that between 2005 and 2022, 17 years passed. So a very long period of time. That is exceptional, and this is because of the blockages by Greece, France, and Bulgaria. But in other cases, this was some period between 1 and 2 years again. And then negotiation accession talks begin, which is actually the core period. This is really when the rules are defined, when the laws are changed, when the country gets ready to join. And this is the main period, which again takes, in Bulgaria, it took 4 years. In Croatia, it took 6 years. In Montenegro and Serbia, it began over a decade ago in Montenegro and 9 years ago in Serbia, and is nowhere near to an end. We don't know when it will be completed, but certainly not this year or next year. So it shows you that the process has become longer over the years, partly because the EU has set more comprehensive criteria, especially when it comes to rule of law, but also because the countries have not always been as committed to doing everything necessary to join the European Union. So what we see here is that the countries of the Western Balkans, which until last year were the main countries likely to join the European Union, that after Croatia, which is the only country of the Western Balkans which did join in 2013, so 10 years ago, none of the other countries is likely to join anytime soon. Montenegro is probably the furthest along, but even then it will take at least another 5 to 6 years to join, because basically even once you complete negotiations, all parliaments of the European Union, member states, the European Parliament, and that country's parliament have to ratify, and this can take several years. So you can see here between Croatia ending negotiations and joining, 2 years passed. And so basically, if we add 2 years to the end of talks, negotiations, we can say that Montenegro, in the best case, is likely to join by 2030. So in about 6 to 7 years. And so it means that this is a process has become very long. And this, of course, raises relevant questions we can talk about, which you might have for Ukraine. So if we see here, this is, and I'll conclude, come to a conclusion with that. The two big enlargement packages since the early 1990s have been first the Central and East European enlargement, which was completed with the membership of Romania and Bulgaria in 2007, and the Western Balkans. And what changed was the centrality of the rule of law, which became very important for the Western Balkans. And this was partly not just because of what happened in the Western Balkans, but every enlargement, new enlargement, is based on the experience of the previous enlargement. And they realized that the rule of law was not as well protected as many hoped for in Central and Eastern Europe. And so they gave more emphasis on rule of law with the next round of enlargement, which on one side you could say is a very positive development because rule of law is essential for democracy. But at the same time, you could also be critical and can say it has made the process even longer. And this is, I think, a really interesting and relevant question of what will enlargement look like for Ukraine, because we don't know yet what the rules and the procedures will be exactly. The other element which is relevant for Ukraine and is the fact that the enlargement towards Central and Eastern Europe was enlargement towards countries which had experienced the collapse of communism and the establishment of democracy and market economy, but not a war. The countries of the Western Balkans, with the exception of Albania, but even that experienced a kind of conflict, they all experienced war in the 1990s. So it was not just about democracy, but also about post-war legacies to deal with. And then the other element which we're seeing is that the EU itself has become more skeptical about enlargement than it was in the 1990s and 2000s. And a lot of that experience, that change has to do, I would argue, not so much with enlargement, but with a general skepticism towards the EU by many citizens. And this is a result of what some people have called the poly or multi-crises of in Europe. So basically, ever since the 2008, Europe has been confronted non-stop crises. It was first the economic crisis of the global economic collapse. It was followed by the Eurozone crisis, which affected Greece in particular, with the economic difficulties and the Eurozone crisis, as it was called. Then we had the Brexit crisis, the crisis of surrounding Britain's vote to leave the European Union. We had the Trump anti-migration crisis of very rigid anti-migration policies by Hungary, and migration seen as a threat, and the rise of populism in Europe and in North America. We had the COVID pandemic, and finally, we've had the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And so the EU has been obsessed with many issues besides enlargement, and that has made enlargement more difficult in the last 15 years. So it means that this is slowed down enlargement, and I think one of the very important question is really today about the next enlargement, and I think there are questions I can raise here in conclusion, which nobody has an answer for yet. But the question is really whether Ukraine, together with Moldova, will join in the same way as the countries of the Western Balkans are going to join the European Union. And the question is, will the process be the same? The formal steps towards joining? What will the timeline look like? Practically and in terms of substance. Will the countries of the Western Balkans join first and then Ukraine and Moldova? Or will they be part of a joint process? Will they maybe join at the same time? All of these are unknown questions. It is clear that also Ukraine is by far bigger than the Western Balkans. The Western Balkans has a total population of around 17 million, which is, of course, less than half of the population of Ukraine alone. This raises questions, not just of financial sort, but also of the balance of power in the European Union. And all of these are part of the political considerations. So I would say that maybe in conclusion, to join the European Union, democratization is one important pillar, and one which is in many ways not fully resolved, because it is clear that to join the European Union, one has to be a democracy. The question is how to set the right criteria to make sure a country remains democratic and is democratic when it joins. I would argue that it's impossible to be 100% sure that a country remains democratic once it's in, because no country in the world can provide a permanent guarantee that it will always remain democratic. Think about the United States, which is one of the oldest democracies. Under the presidency of Donald Trump, it has become considerably less democratic. A president who openly rejected key elements of democracy. And that tells you that even old democracies can become less democratic. So it's very hard to ensure that in the enlargement process, a country is so democratic that it can't go backwards. So this is the big question. In fact, it would require the EU to change its rules to make sure it can deal with the lack of democracy once in the European Union better, so that it can let countries in without worrying that they might turn to become authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, like Hungary has become. But democracy is part of the story. Another part of the story is the ability of the country to join the European Union in terms of its own economic structures, as well as the willingness of EU citizens to support enlargement. And this is really essential because politicians in the European Union are going to put the brakes on enlargement if they feel that they're going to lose elections if they are not supported by enlargement. So citizens are important to convince because they might be against enlargement, even if a country is democratic, even if it is ready. And we have discovered, I've been part of a group, we've been doing research about enlargement in France and in Netherlands, and we discovered that two countries which are quite skeptical, that citizens are in fact more supportive about enlargement than one thinks. But what is crucial is that citizens who know the countries are more likely to be supportive of enlargement than those who don't know the country. So familiarity, knowledge is very important. And in a certain way, a certain sense of support. And certainly this makes it more likely for Ukraine to get support from EU member states because citizens are aware and are in most majorities sympathetic and have solidarity with the citizens of Ukraine in their fight against Russian aggression. But there certainly are many challenges ahead to convince citizens of the European Union not just to be supportive of Ukraine in times of war, but to be supportive of Ukraine in times of peace, to bring it into the European Union as a full member state. So this is, I would say, to come back to that, a long road, one which is not going to come to an end in a few years, and where there's still many decisions to be made to which we don't have a clear answer yet. So I'll conclude with that, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Bieber. So interesting lecture, and right now I can see that we have some questions. And please, Hikmatullah, this is our students from International Relations from Law faculty. Please, we will have the line of the questions. So first will be the Titush. Please take your floor.
Thank you so much. I'm a student of the Black Sea National University. You talk about Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Which country, for your opinion, has more chance to join European Union? Is there any chance maybe to that these countries will join at one time? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, I think it's very hard to answer this question because we don't even know for the Western Balkans, which have been negotiating for 20 years, whether it will be one country or all countries at once. The logic of the EU has been, the argument has been it should be based on merit. So if a country is ready, it should join. So it's unlikely that all three countries would be ready at the same time. So the logic would be that each country would join alone. The problem is technically it's a lot easier for more than one country to join together than to join singly, because again, to join, you have to have all of the parliaments ratify the agreements. And it might be easier to get support for all of them together than individually. But only, I would argue, if they're ready roughly at the same time. So, let's say if Ukraine is ready in 1 year and then, the next year it looks like what seems very close that, let's say, Moldova is ready, then maybe they would be treated together. But if there's a big gap, I don't think so. So I would think that they probably would be joined together if there is a logic in terms of the timing, but not if there's a big gap between them. Now, the readiness depends a lot on the countries. Now, of course, I mean, on one side, you could say it's impossible for Ukraine to join without, it can only happen after the end of the war. It's very, I don't think the EU is willing to take a member state who is in an active war by, even, of course, the war is not Ukraine's fault. It's a fault of Russian aggression, but I think the EU does not want to have a member state which is in an open war against another country. But of course, we have similar problems, different way though, with Moldova, with Transnistria being not under the control of the government, and Georgia with Ossetia and Abkhazia not being under the control of the government. So all three have these big difficulties about joining the European Union. I think without a war, these things are solvable because, for example, Cyprus, which is a member of the European Union, has part of its territory which is under control of Turkey and still has joined the European Union. I think in the EU, nobody's happy about that because this creates all kinds of legal problems. But I think it's possible for a country to join if things are not resolved as long as there's no war. Now, I would say at the moment, it seems very hard to imagine that I think Georgia would join before Ukraine, because I think the only reason, to be honest, the only reason Georgia and Moldova got candidate status is because of Ukraine. Without Ukraine's, without the war in Ukraine and the solidarity with Ukraine, nobody would have gotten the status of candidate. So in that sense, it would seem very strange for any of the other two countries to be faster than Ukraine in joining the European Union. It still might happen, but I think at the moment, I think the Ukraine is seen as the central country among the three. And unless Ukraine's leadership in the future does not do what it needs to do, I think Ukraine will be the main country and the first country to join the European Union among those three at the moment. But again, saying more than that would be speculation.
Thank you for the answer. There are a lot of things that we can think about. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you very much for answer. We have the next question from Daria. Please, Daria, take your floor.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Daria Hnatyuk. I am a third-year student at Petro-Mahila Black Sea National University. Can you please answer, can the EU's enlargement policy be seen as an effective tool for democratization, or does it face limitation in fostering genuine democratic reforms in candidate countries? I mean, is the European policy really effective, or are there difficulties in promoting democratization in the way the EU works for countries that want to join their organization? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, Daria. I mean, I think you're raising a very good question, and I think it's difficult to answer entirely because on one side, the EU provides a very strong incentive for democratization, because it says if you become more democratic, you get more reward than just becoming a democracy, which is a big reward. But it says, okay, it gives you also the reward of being able to join the European Union, which provides for important economic, political benefits. So this is a great incentive to make to make a country become a stable, functioning democracy. So that's a positive side. The negative side, I would say, is that the EU sometimes lacks the good instruments of measuring what is a good democracy, because it's sometimes very difficult to be precise about it. Now, it's easy to say when is a country approximately democratic, but it's very difficult sometimes to be identifying the real problems of a democracy. When is a country, what are really undemocratic practices? And the EU lacks sometimes the clear standards of that. But also, and I think this is the biggest problem, that we see that the EU is divided, and that sometimes individual member states try to abuse the European Union. We see this at the moment that, for example, the commissioner in charge of enlargement is a Hungarian politician who is close to Viktor Orban. So he is pushing, for example, for Serbia to join the European Union, even though I would say it's not democratic, but because he's promoting the politics of Viktor Orban, who wants to have actually more undemocratic countries in the European Union, like his own country. And so the EU is being, because the EU is not one actor, it has all of the member states shaping it. So if you have an undemocratic country in the EU, it might shape what the EU is doing. I think one good thing of Ukraine applying for membership and getting candidate status is that the next commissioner in charge of enlargement will not be Orban's assistant, because I don't think the EU can afford to have an Orban politician in charge of enlargement when it comes to Ukraine, because of the very problematic stand of Hungary under Orban towards Ukraine. But there are, also, as I mentioned, sometimes countries block membership process, not because of democracy, but because of their own interests. So Bulgaria. So this can actually work against democratization. I would say in the case of North Macedonia today, it has not helped democracy in North Macedonia if EU membership is blocked because Bulgaria says Macedonians have to recognize that they are actually, their history is Bulgarian. This is it's not a democratic point, and it undermines democracy in North Macedonia. So I would say, to answer your question, Daria, officially, formally, it can help democratization, but there are ways in which the EU works in practice sometimes, which can unfortunately make democratization more difficult and which can put obstacles in the way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, for the answer. And the next question from Anastasia. Anastasia, please take your floor.
Yes. Hello, I have a question. As we know, the European Union always seeks its explanation. And what do you think are the negative consequences of the EU enlargement exist?
Mm-hmm. So the negative sides of enlargement, basically.
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, generally, I do think that joining the European Union has been a success story for most countries. So I would say, if you manage to join, it's overwhelmingly a positive result. Now, I would say that joining might be sometimes difficult, and that there can be negative sides to that. When you actually manage to join, it's positive. It doesn't mean that everything is good, right? I think part of the problem is sometimes citizens have too high expectations of what happens when you join. There's a big firework, there's a big celebration, and the next day you wake up and your country looks exactly the same like it did before. Change happens slowly. So it's not that everything becomes better overnight. It's not that in the EU, there are plenty of regions which are economically depressed, which are not doing very well. So it's not that you become prosperous overnight. So I think one side is that people get disappointed because they expect more. The other problem, and I think this is something we do see in countries which are economically weaker, is that people can migrate easily. And you can say from the perspective of individuals, it's a good thing. People can choose, right? It's if you are a citizen of the European Union, and if you're from Bulgaria or if you're from Croatia and you live in an area which is poor, you can say, I can get twice the salary if I go to Austria. And I can do it. I can get a legal job. I have no problem to move there. I'm allowed to do it. It's my right as an EU citizen to move. So it's good for an individual, but it can be bad for a society. So if you go to Croatia, there are large areas today where hundreds of thousands of people moved, or Bulgaria. And these are areas which have become less developed, depopulated as a result. And so this is something which happens in the European Union. And so in that sense, you could say this could be a negative thing for a particular region, not for the people who leave, but for a region which becomes, as a result, depopulated. And I think this is a real, this can really, be a problem. So I would say these are probably the main disadvantages, and that, of course, if you join the European Union, your businesses are in competition with some of the best businesses in the world, and this is why also one of the Copenhagen criteria is they say that the market economy has to be able to function within this large market, because all of a sudden you have German retail companies, producers who compete with you, and that can make some companies go bankrupt because they're not as able to compete. So there might be a downside for businesses at first who are not able to kind of be, who are not efficient enough to manage in this European landscape, who have less experience. So there are certainly challenges. And if you look at a place like Croatia, which is the last country which has joined, I would say there are certain regions which have benefited from the European Union more than others. And it depends a lot on how smart are governments in taking advantage of joining the European Union. So it's some governments, people have been critical of Bulgaria or Romania to say, or even Croatia, that the governments have not been making good advantage of the membership. So it means, for example, making sure that you take lots of the money which is available for a country to join the European Union. It's not just money which is transferred to the bank account of the government's budget, but these are structural funds for which the country has to have good plans. The government has to have good plans of how to invest it. If it's not invested in a transparent way, the EU doesn't give you the money, right? So it means that basically you lose the money because it's not used. It's not made available. So then you can have a situation where actually your country does not benefit from being a member as much as it could, because the government doesn't have the ability to absorb the money in a transparent way. And then the money doesn't get used. So in a certain way, a lot of the ability to take maximum advantage of joining the European Union is up to the government to use the resources well. For example, to develop the areas which are underdeveloped, to invest into them so that people don't leave. But that depends a lot on the governments. If the governments are competent, not corrupt, and serious about it. And so if you have a bad government in the European Union, they might lose on a lot of opportunities to transform the country. And that's a big test. And not all countries have done that well.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for answering.
Thank you very much for question, for answer. And next, we jump to the question from Yulia. Yulia, please take the floor.
Thank you. My name is Yulia. I am a student of the Black Sea National University, named after Petro Mahila. You talk about Balkans, Ukraine. What about Turkey? Does the Turkish society want to join the European Union, for your opinion? And can the near future elections affect the relations between the European Union and Turkey?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Yulia. Officially, at the moment, talks with Turkey are frozen, but of course they could be reopened when it comes to negotiations with Turkey. It seems clear that with the government of Erdogan, Turkey cannot join. I think the EU does not trust the government of Erdogan, and Erdogan does not really want to join the European Union anymore. But I think a new government, a different government in Turkey could change that. I think it doesn't look likely, I would say, unfortunately, that the government will change at the moment in Turkey. But if it were, whenever that will happen, the big question certainly will be, will there be a new movement towards joining the European Union? Officially, it's possible. officially, Turkey can restart negotiations and be as much in the process as and officially it's further along than Ukraine because it has had negotiations begun already, just that they froze. But I think so. On one side is the question of democracy. Will there be a democratic government interested in joining the European Union? And the second big question is how hostile is the EU public towards Turkey's membership? And this is, for example, in Austria, there was just a survey a few weeks ago about joining the European Union, about which countries, and Austrians are the most against Turkey joining. A vast majority of Austrian citizens is against Turkey's membership. Many more are in favor of Ukraine joining. But a lot of it has to do with that people, this might change if Erdogan is no longer president, but a lot of it has to do also with negative views of Turkey. Turkey is even bigger, nearly twice as big as Ukraine, and that's also another factor. It borders on very difficult countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So there are lots of worries, as well as the worry about a large Islamic country in Europe. So I think some of these worries are justified, some of them are not, but I think it will make it much more difficult for Turkey to join. But it certainly will be back on the agenda once there's a government after Erdogan.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one more question from Asia. Asia, please, Asia, take the floor.
Yeah. Yes. I understand that this question is not directly related to politics, but I still like to ask it. I suggest that the main reason of Brexit was austerity. So the British government just wanted to cut government spending and reduce public borrowing, and they actually believed that leaving the EU would provide the UK with greater economic freedom and flexibility, for example. So in terms of economic, relevance, how much does the enlargement cost for EU countries that are actually already in the EU? And is it possible that European voters, European citizens are against the enlargement because it's high cost, at least from the beginning? But I think you've answered this question already. So will anyone just repeat Brexit? We heard a lot about Paul exit in 2021, for example, in your opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think to answer the first question, I mean, if you look at the financial contributions, I mean, the biggest net contributor to the European Union has always been Germany because of the largest size and the economy. And there's no significant political party in Germany asking for Brexit or Grexit or whatever you would call it. And I think it's true that the argument of some Brexiteers in the UK was that they would save money. I mean, the big bus which went through Britain, which says, the money we save from Brexit, from the EU, will go to the NHS, the National Health Service. And of course, none of that has happened because you cannot measure EU membership only by the money you pay into the contributions to the European Union, because you gain a lot, through the access to markets and so on. And we see that Britain has not at all economically benefited from leaving the European Union. And so the argument that it costs to be a member of the EU is a very populist argument, and one which is not borne out by genuine economic calculations. There's a financial cost to leaving the European Union. And this is why it's very interesting. Once at the time Brexit happened, there were lots of people who were saying, well, this is the first of many. And now nobody talks about leaving the European Union. None of the Euro skeptic far-right political parties on Europe are strongly strongly in favor of leaving the European Union. Now we have a far-right government in Italy led by Giorgia Meloni of the Fratelli d'Italia, And they are not at all, in no way, talking about leaving the European Union. Even Marine Le Pen, who was the main contender in the last year's presidential election in France, she was pro-French exit at the time of Brexit, and she dropped it because she realized you cannot win elections in France with that platform. And one of the reasons, not the only one, but one important reason is that the disaster of Brexit, that Brexit has not been so you cannot point to Brexit as a success story, and so this makes it not very attractive. And one of the reasons is that the EU has said very clearly, if you leave the European Union, you do not get any of the advantages of being in the EU market. You can't have, Europe a la carte, of saying we just take the benefits, but we don't take the costs. And this is why it's not very attractive. And so from this point of view, I don't think that leaving the European Union is on the agenda at the moment. And I don't see it really being repeated in any country anytime soon.
Yes, thank you very much for answer. One more question, please. Professor Solovyova, take the floor.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the very interesting lecture. We are very grateful that you are here with us. It's really very important for us. And I'd like to ask about the next. Is there any chance that, given the circumstances, Ukraine, the process of becoming the member of the EU for Ukraine will be simplified or accelerated, some kind of fast track, or maybe it would be even more complicated because of Russian aggression? What's your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question. I mean, I would say we don't know yet. That's the simple answer, because I think in the EU you have two different forces. You have the forces of France, let's say, who are anyhow skeptical about enlargement, and they've been saying we cannot treat any country different than others, because it's not about treatment of countries, but it's about being ready to be a member of the European Union. So Ukraine will not be treated differently. It has to fulfill all of the same criteria. And then you have other countries who are saying, yes, but, Ukraine is a unique situation. We need to show our solidarity. And it also means that maybe not full membership, but something else, be more creative. I think a full member in the way in which, let's say, Austria is a member now, is a long process. And I think that's not going to happen overnight, because, as I mentioned, the EU membership requires this legal coherence, and this legal coherence requires all these laws to be adopted and so on. And I think nobody wants a shortcut on that, because otherwise you question this legal union, and that's the foundation of the European Union. But I think the creative thinking, and I think people are discussing this, is we also have this in the Balkans. It's called like staged accession. So to join the European Union in multiple steps, so that there isn't just either you're outside or you're inside, but there's things in between. And so these things in between mean that for example, Ukraine would be part of many of the decision making, could be represented in different bodies without being a full member state. Get some of the financial means, but is not a full member. And so basically, I think this is what I would think is the most realistic scenario, is to say full membership will take, for Ukraine, I would say, 10 years or maybe more, because that's just the duration of the process. But that there will be closer, more realistic steps before that, which signal to Ukraine, first of all, you are part of our community. You are welcome. You are, you have a future in the European Union on a symbolic level, but also with very specific benefits of being already there, whether they might be political or whether they might be financial. So I think this is because everybody you talk to, in the European Union, realizes that the process in the Western Balkans has not been successful, that it's been 20 years since the beginning and only one country has joined. So just saying we're going to continue what we've been doing in the Western Balkans for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia is not really a good idea, because it's just going to take too long. So I think there's an understanding that we have to insist on the criteria to become a full member, but we should think about these preliminary or first steps. So I think this is the thinking. But I don't think there's yet a full agreement of what this looks like and what it means. And it might mean something else for Ukraine than it means for Bosnia or for Serbia, because everybody needs this interim step, because it's also very hard to keep citizens motivated to say, okay, you can join the European Union in 20 years, you know, who's going to care? But if you see these interim steps, these concrete elements, then I think it's more realistic. So I think this is the direction, but I think we'll have to see, and it depends a lot also. And I've been drafting a memo for colleagues in Kiev about, you know, what to learn from the Western Balkans. And one of the points I say, keep knocking on the door of the European Union. You know, if you wait for the EU to invite you in, you would not be invited. And Ukraine has candidate status now because Ukraine asked for it and said, we want in. And I think this is one very important element. Of course, you have to deliver. You have to do what it takes in terms of reforms and be serious about it. And citizens have to push the government saying, your leadership in war is one thing and admirable, but you also have to deliver on the reforms to join the European Union. And you have to bang on the door of the European Union, because the EU will always find excuses to keep you waiting. But if you're pushing and pushing and pushing, then the EU will have no excuses. And that's, I think, very important.
Thank you so much for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much for really very full answer for all questions. Any questions?
May I ask one more questions, please? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, of course. Take the floor, please.
So the European Union takes away some part of sovereignty, but nevertheless, such actors as Germany and France recognize themselves as independent actors in the international arena. So is there any prospects that the European Union as a single state entity will influence international politics?
Yes. No, I mean, I think the countries do understand that they have much more power collectively than individually. I mean, even France and Germany, as you say. And, you know, I personally come from Luxembourg, and, you know, you can imagine a country of Luxembourg, which is, you know, around 500,000 inhabitants. It feels like it has a lot more power being member of the EU than if it were by itself. So that's, I think, a realization, which even if you talk to German diplomats, you know, they understand that their weight is greater internationally with China or with the US than if they were by themselves. But I think that the difficulty is really to find coherence in message. I mean, I think one of the big achievements, and I'm very glad that, you know, with all the weaknesses of the European Union, it's found, you know, basically with the absence of Hungary, a very clear message in supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression. And I think this is something which I'm very happy about, because I think that's the right policy. But it shows you also that it's sometimes very difficult for the EU to speak in one voice. And, you know, Hungary has made it a lot, I mean, not Hungary, Viktor Orban's government, which is an undemocratic government, has made it a lot more difficult for the EU to find a unified language when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to policies to confront Russian aggression. So this is the difficulty. The EU is based on moments of coherence and joint messages, and they're not always easy to achieve. I think the EU has become more unified through the pandemic and Russian aggression, both of which helped the EU to find responses in a way which people did not expect before that. But it certainly shows you also there's still a long way to go, and the EU will not speak with one voice anytime soon. So it's a gradual process. I don't think the EU will ever become a state, a single actor. I think it will become one which is more coherent, because everybody realizes it's sometimes better to be less insistent on your own interests and try to seek them collectively. but this is not easy. And I think it's always a renegotiation. But I think the one thing which is surprising, I think, again, if we look at the many crises the EU has faced in the last 15 years, people often predicted the EU would fall apart. It would fall apart with the economic crisis. It would fall apart with the Brexit, with the Greek crisis. Brexit would kill it. And still it's alive. And in fact, it's stronger than it was 15 years ago. So this leaves me somewhat optimistic that with all the criticism of the EU and all its weaknesses, that it still is actually such a necessity for its member states that it will survive and will probably become more coherent, but not a unified actor. So that's certainly something which I think is unified when it needs to be on certain issues, but not on everything.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. And Florian, probably the last one from my side. I also had a question, and we will move to the end of our meeting today. So how do you think, what role values play in the European Union enlargement process?
And I think values play an important role. I think, first of all, in whether or not you want to join. I think there are countries which don't want to join because they don't share the values of the European Union, or who are a lot less convincing about joining because they don't share the values. If you're not a democracy, you don't share some of the values of the European Union. And we have governments in the Western Balkans who are talking about the European Union, but you can hear that they don't really care about some key aspects, some key values, such as democracy. You can still try to join, but I think at the end, you cannot join if you're not committed to those values, because it, first of all, means you don't do what it takes. And some member states will say at the end, are you really sure you want to join? So I don't think you can join if you're not committed to democracy. Some members will say no. The problem is, of course, that it's not just about values, because as I mentioned, each individual member state can block you, and they might block a country not because of values, but because of their own narrow interests. And so this is, again, this negotiation between the EU as a coherent unit, which has shared values and shared understanding, and individual interests of member states, which might have nothing to do with the values. And this makes it, of course, very difficult sometimes. So I think in a certain way, ideally, it's only about values and, of course, the readiness and the commitment. But sometimes there are other factors which make it more difficult and more complicated along the way.
Thank you very much, Professor Bieber, for such full answer for all questions. And once again, I would like to thank for your very interesting lecture. It was extremely interesting to learn more about aspects of the enlargement and functioning of democracy in the European Union. And special thanks for the interesting discussion and comprehensive answers. Thank you very much to all for joining, and see you soon and new Evadem project events.
Thank you, Alina, for having me, and I hope I'll be able to continue or have another talk in Mykolaiv in person,
of course,
very soon. This would be my wish.
Yeah, I will wish it more all things in the world.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much, Florian. Bye.
Bye-bye.